Bueno, muy buenas tardes para todos y todas. Bueno, aquí en América Latina. Voy a cambiar a inglés, así nuestros colegas de Nueva Zelanda también nos podemos comunicar. Good afternoon to everyone, at least here in Latin America, and good morning in New Zealand. And thank you very much to our colleagues from Statistics New Zealand to be part of this webinar, with series of webinars that we have been conducting, organizing with other NSOs. Last week we had the chance to hear from the experience from Lithuania, and today is time to hear the experience of New Zealand, and next week we will have the opportunity to hear from Norway's experience. So thank you very much for all of the participants to joining us, and it is a great pleasure, and we are really grateful with our colleagues from New Zealand to share their knowledge and experience on using administrative data in the census. Mainly today they will present mainly the experience on 2018 census, but also I think they also explain a little bit about the 2023 census experience on combining traditional census enumeration with administrative data, which is pretty close that the first steps that we are doing here in some countries in Latin America, and we really appreciate your time on sharing this experience. Let me introduce our distinguished speakers. Chris Galvin, Chief Methodologist at Statistics in New Zealand, and he has spent most of his 40-year career with Statistics New Zealand, alongside stint with other national statistical agencies in London and Australia. Vince is the inaugural chair of the Pacific Statistics Regional Methods Board. In recent years, Vince has been on the board of RANS, the New Zealand Private Sector Market Research Industry Body, and has been active in the analytics industry. Internationally, Vince is a member of the executive committee of the high-level group of the modernization of official statistics. Also, Nathaniel Mason-Dunning, principal analyst as Statistics New Zealand Census methodology team. Nathaniel has worked at Statistics New Zealand for over 10 years in the areas of demography, administrative data, and on the 2018 and 2023 censuses. He has most recently led the development and implementation of methodology for including administrative data in New Zealand's 2023 census. And A.B. Morgan is a principal analyst with Statistics New Zealand. She has spent most of her 13 years in the method and design area, operating as a technical leader in census and coverage methodology. A.B. was a member of the International Steering Group, providing advice and assurance of the Cotran Census 2022. A.B.'s experience and passion area include data quality methodology, total error frameworks, survey methods and operation, and coverage population estimation. Vince, please, the floor is yours. If you want to share your screen, if you have a presentation or Yes, please go ahead.
Hola, or as we say in New Zealand, kia ora. It's a briefing from our Maori population. Thank you, Federico. I just want to emphasize that it is a great pleasure for us to be participating in this webinar. We felt that we learned a lot from 2018 census, and we are always happy to share whatever learnings we obtain from that experience with our friends in the international statistical community. Most of the seminar, well, this morning our time, this afternoon your time, will be about the technical work that we did in 2018. But I thought I would begin the material from Statistics New Zealand with some overview remarks in terms of the experience of, mainly of the experience of the technical people working on the 2018 census. So I will just make these verbally, and then we will use the, we'll start the presentation. The first category of points that I wanted to share our experience, I've called that there are some particular circumstances or that arise from using administrative data in this way in filling out the census file. The most significant of these, that after we had done it, I had wished that we had made more preparations for, was realizing that this approach inevitably means identifying some thresholds for inclusion into the file. These may be parameters of models. They may be when you have sufficient confidence about the geography to include an individual record in the file. But the truth is that there is a certain amount of arbitrariness about these thresholds, and it was highly desirable to have the criteria for inclusion identified well ahead of seeing the impact. In our particular case in New Zealand, we have some uses of the census file that translate immediately into consequences in our electoral system. And we couldn't really be in the situation where we tried to see what the impact of one set of inclusion criteria would be and then modify the results after we'd had a look at the impact. So setting your arrangements up so that you've separated the setting of those inclusion thresholds with the from being able to see their consequences was something that we had to worry about, and I would urge you to give consideration to. The other aspect of this that I thought I would emphasize was that this type of file, once created, has errors of a type that your users are not used to seeing. In particular, because we are including in the file records where we are satisfied that the individual is living, in our case, in New Zealand, but we have weak information or relatively weak information about their geography, we end up with records in the file where we have good data on their age or their gender, but we can't locate them at an address. This is obviously if you are only used to using a census file where all the data was collected from an address, users are not used to having this problem. And you need to prepare the users for dealing with this situation, because they see it, their instinct is that they're taking a step backwards, even though this inclusion certainly improves the quality of the file. In a similar vein, we have to, you also have to ready your users for the realization that there is quite a lot of variability in quality across the file. Clearly, where for the records where you have good administrative data, you can add these into the file. So for some records in the file, you have your normal full census information, but for other records, you may only have a very thin set of data. In our experience, users took a little while to understand that they had to look much more carefully at the file than they were used to doing. And we had to construct a whole system of quality ratings for individual variables, so to help guide them through their use of the file. I had a number of other points, but I think probably I'll confine myself to saying that the most essential of them was that being able, in the same vein, to have some sort of external reference committee, which you're clearly giving a lot of consideration to, and having a prominent person in that committee available to the media was very useful in our context. When we finally presented the file, and there had been a lot of adverse publicity about the response rate all through the collection period, when we finally presented the results of the 2018 census at a media conference, having one of New Zealand's most prominent statisticians able to answer the first question, which was, why should we believe these results, which the first question the media asked, and to have our prominent professor who had previously been seen as willing to criticize the file, saying, I have looked through the methods and they are adequate for this purpose, removed the anxiety in the media immediately. The only final remark I would make, which I'm sure which you may not think is necessary, but I would urge you to move forward through this process with confidence. You'll be following good methods. You'll be improving the quality of the file. From our understanding of your situation, you are in better circumstances than we were when they started. We are envious that you have a reviewed person register. We are envious that you have a unique ID. And your response rate seems higher than the response rate we started with. So I would urge you to proceed with your work with confidence. Abby, but would you please take over and start talking through the technical work?
Great, and I'll just share the screen.
Thanks, Vince. Okay.
That's all good.
Okay, hopefully everyone can see slides and me if they wish. So first of all, I guess a request or a meeting thing. We are happy to take questions as we go through. We have our information in chunks, so we can pause and take questions as we go. We also have Spanish speakers with us, so if you want to put Spanish written questions into the chat, we should be able to handle that. Cool. Okay, so I'm going to introduce the 2018 census situation and a little bit about how we moved from what was planned to what was mitigated. And then I will talk about the framework for how we took decisions, which Vince hinted at in terms of how do you decide what to include and what not to include, and in a way that is robust and perceived with integrity. Okay, so in New Zealand, we do a census of population and dwellings. So we aim to produce the best possible count and information about people, dwellings, households, and families. The 2018 census was planned to use a modernized traditional model. So we had a full enumeration in the field where we wanted to enable and gain response from all individuals, dwellings and households. The collection was designed to be digital first, and we heavily encouraged self-response. We then conducted field-based non-response follow-up to increase the response that hadn't been self-complete. At the time, our response monitoring during the field operation suggested that we had a lower than ideal response rate. So we did extend our collection period. When we closed, we still had a less than ideal response rate. In terms of planned use of admin data, we had that focused in 3 places. The first was to support field operation through the use of admin address sources as inputs into our census dwelling frame. This was from a first iteration of a location register. We also planned to use admin data to fill gaps in respondent records for missing items. So if a respondent had refused a question or missed a question, we plan to use admin data for that. We had also planned to use admin data for quality assessment of our results. So as comparison population estimates, as well as comparison of response information in terms of quality and consistency with administrative data. Our planned methods for unit non-response were based on our 2013 methodology, and these were based in statistical imputation. So we had a process to impute missing individuals and missing households. So we would put individuals into incomplete or partially responding dwellings, as well as individuals into wholly non-responding dwellings. We only plan to place households into occupied dwellings, and occupancy was determined by our field exercise. As I mentioned, during the field operation and at the close, we observed a lower than expected response rate. We wanted to hit a target of 94% response, and at the time of closing, our best estimate was we had total response forms from about 84%, and we had another 5% that we had a list of the individual, but we didn't have a completed form. So we were quite a long way from our desired response rate. And so, as you can imagine, a lot of analysis followed. The analysis we did focused on 3 major areas. The first was population distribution against expectations. Our analysis here looked at geographic breakdowns by age, sex, ethnicity, our Indigenous status, as well as a few others that I can't remember. The analysis showed that it was a geographically widespread problem, but it was worse in areas that were high in hard to count groups. So in New Zealand, our hard to count groups are typically our ethnic minority groups and youth, so in the bracket of 15 to 29 years of age, and typically males as well. We also had lower response across all ages and ethnicities, but again, it was worse for those hard to count groups. So it was a mixture of an everywhere problem, as well as an intensified pattern of our usual response challenges. Another part of analysis looked at dwelling distribution by type and occupancy. This was to check that we hadn't missed places where people live, and that was why we were missing the people. Analysis here showed us we had little evidence of a significant undercount in dwellings, and also little evidence of an undercount of occupied dwellings. There was one region that had lower than expected occupied dwellings, but we concluded dwellings wasn't a major driver of our lower than expected response. Another key part of our analysis was to look at the relationship between people and dwellings. So in our responding population, we had an average household size that was smaller than expected. And that meant that if we were to place the remaining population into the non-responding dwellings, we ended up with very high household sizes for those non-responding dwellings. So this showed us that it wouldn't make sense or be fit for purpose for us to go ahead with our planned option. So using planned statistical imputation via donor imputation would result in a population that was too low. Conversely, trying to fit the people into the available occupied dwellings would end up with very odd household statistics. So our solution, eventually, it took us a while and lots of failed ideas before we landed on a solution. But the solution was to extend the planned use of administrative data. So we built on our extensive existing research from our census transformation program. We took the key elements that we understood well, and Nathaniel will speak in detail to these shortly. And so the parts that we knew well was how to produce a New Zealand usual resident population measure directly from admin data, how to group individuals in the admin population into households. We knew a lot about the strengths and weaknesses of those two processes, And we also knew a lot about different types of error that could be introduced along the way. A particular concern for us was linkage error and how we would estimate that at scale. We also had some elements that we developed in progress with the solution. One of those was the framework for decision making and the guiding principles for our methodology. And the other part was the exact details. So Vince mentioned the thresholds and the somewhat arbitrary decisions. And so those taking decisions about how to set those thresholds was where a lot of our energy went. I will take a pause there in case there are questions. No, cool. I will keep going. Okay. Sorry, managing two screens. So now I'll talk a bit about that decision-making framework. Quite early on into us exploring admin data as a solution, we came up with some guiding principles. We base these in the data quality dimensions that we use in our New Zealand data quality model. The 5 dimensions I've got presented here are very common across statistical agencies and United Nations guidance. So in regards to relevance, we took a principle that population structure, so high quality counts about people, was more important than producing high quality information about families and households. Ideally, we would achieve both, but if we had to create a priority, population structure was at the forefront. We also took a principle that admin data was better than donor imputation. This is in part because it uses real data about real people, but also because the item or variable information available under an admin data source was more comprehensive than what we could reliably achieve using donor imputation. Another principle we had was a preference for under coverage rather than over coverage. So in New Zealand, our coverage measure does not influence the population counts that form the census file. We do it as a separate measure that then goes into our population estimates. So our customers and data users are used to a history of New Zealand having a net undercount in the census file. They're far less familiar with overcount and how to deal with that. Our accuracy principles were to only include admin data and imputation when it improves the quality of the data set. And also to only use sources that we knew to have acceptable quality and coverage. This was a general do no harm principle, and we held on to that quite strongly. Other principles we had were to consider the time series, both backwards in terms of how would this census series relate to our historic censuses, but also forwards. We were already partway through a transformation program to move our census towards being more heavily based in admin data. So we gave consideration to how our 2018 census methods could act as a stepping stone. Timeliness and release dates were an ever-present pressure. Our customers were not happy with the delays. So we wanted to get something out quickly, but we also needed it to be robust. And lastly, we needed to be able to communicate what we were doing and why we believed it was fit for purpose. So we wanted to keep it simple wherever we could. And when it was complex, we needed to be able to explain it in simple terms. Putting these principles into practice with the solution we ended up with looks like this. So we would include admin enumerations when they would reduce rather than increase biases in the census data set. We would include admin enumerations into a mesh block, which for us is a small geographic area. Including records in a geographic area is more valuable than not representing them at all. But including them in a dwelling when we are confident is more valuable again. We require stronger evidence when adding in a record that would alter information about a census respondent. This was particularly applicable in households that had responded but hadn't provided forms for everyone in the household. And lastly, some error at the individual level is acceptable if overall distributions are improved. That last one was a particular challenge for our Indigenous population. And we had to handle that quite carefully. And lastly, Vince mentioned the importance of having a group of experts to support you in this process. So we quite quickly convened a group we called the External Data Quality Panel. This was a panel of independent experts brought together with a broad range of local and international expertise in demography, census models, and statistical methodology. The panel met regularly over about a 2-year period where we were diagnosing the problem, coming up with solutions, implementing the solution, and then evaluating the output data sets. Their role varied over time. So in the beginning, they were helpful in helping us understand the problem and what directions we might go with for solutions. They were also, as Vince mentioned, incredibly helpful at the dissemination point. So as we were finalizing our data, as we were finalizing our documentation to help users understand what we had done and why, and for communicating the limitations with our data users. The panel published 2 reports as well as supporting documentation that was directly for data users to understand the data. And as Vince mentioned, they were very helpful when it came to managing public perception and the media. I will pause there for questions. Federico, is there any, would you like us to pause with questions, or are you happy for us to move on to Nathaniel?
It's up to you. I will be collecting the question, and maybe at the end we will have a slot for question and answer.
Excellent.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
With that, here's Nathaniel.
Great. Hi, everyone. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about some of the methodology in more detail. And some of this will be focused on the administrative data methodology itself, a lot of which was or existed in research prior to the 2018 census. And then I will touch in a little bit about some of the process for actually combining that admin data with the census responses that we received. So as Vince mentioned, we don't have a formal statistical register system in New Zealand, and we also don't have a unique personal identifier across the country. What we do have, though, is what we call the IDI, and that contains a wide range of linked data from both administrative and survey census data sets. This is a representation of that IDI. At the center of the IDI, we have what we call the spine, and this is made up of 3 key data sets. It's all New Zealand birth records, it's all tax registrations, and it's also visa approvals for when someone moves to New Zealand to live or work or study. And the idea behind this spine is that it contains, or it's an idea of an ever resident population of New Zealand. Basically, anyone who has or could have lived in New Zealand over the past 100 years or so. And then what we do is we link a range of other data sets to this spine, as you can see on the left. So this includes health data, it includes education data, it includes some of the other surveys that Stats New Zealand runs, and it also includes the censuses once they are complete. And the final result of this is that it's a fairly comprehensive database about people both across time and also across all of these different sources domains. And this IDI is available for research, but also increasingly for official statistics. I will just note here that all of the linking is done probabilistically. We don't have that national identifier, so it's done using information like names, date of birth, etc. It still works pretty well, but it does mean that there is some possibility of linkage error across all of those different sources. Shown a slightly different way, this again kind of across the top looks at the different data sources that we have available in that IDI, and then the types of information that we can get from these different data sources. And perhaps unsurprisingly, it's quite complicated. A lot of these sources contain similar information. So the country of birth, for example, we might get that information from birth records. We might get it from our border movements. we might get it from previous censuses. Others, such as address, which I'll talk a bit more about later, we get from many, many different sources. So one of the key parts of our process of using this data is to take that spine, which is that ever resident concept, and extract an estimate of who is resident within New Zealand on a given day. So in the case of the 2018 census, that's basically who was considered a New Zealand usual residence in March 2018. And here we use this signs of life approach, where we start by taking people who have shown some activity in various data sources over a period of time. So that might be people who have paid tax, it might be people who have enrolled in education, people who have visited the doctor. And that roughly gives a pretty good indication of who was in New Zealand across that period. We then apply this second set of rules to remove people who died before the reference date. And for that, we have high quality death records. And we can also look at people who might have migrated, left the country to live elsewhere, as well as people who might have been in New Zealand, but only temporarily. And in New Zealand, we're pretty lucky with this part because we do have, as an island country, we have pretty much perfect information about who has entered or left the country. And that's all linked together. So we can be pretty confident in identifying this group of people. The challenges for us here are, again, more around that linkage error. If we make incorrect links between different data sources, if we miss links, as well as the statistical definition of what counts as a usual resident. But we have rules in place to do that. And here is just a visual representation of the quality of that admin resident population. This might even be a slightly old graph, and it might look a little bit better than this now. But the main point is that the top two lines there, which represent our official population estimates, as well as our admin population, are both pretty similar across age groups as seen here, but also across other breakdowns such as sex or gender or ethnicity. Sometimes for small geographic areas, they can be a little bit more variable, but still pretty good. So that gives us a really good starting point in terms of knowing who likely was in the population. But obviously, one of the other really important elements is determining where those people live. And this tends to be a slightly more complicated process or challenging process. As I mentioned before, many different agencies do collect information about addresses, but they can be somewhat variable in quality. Here we don't have any legal requirement for people to update addresses within a given period of time. And so that often means that there might be quite considerable delays in between someone moving and between them actually letting anyone know officially. And this is, again, perhaps not surprisingly, particularly challenging for certain populations. We know that young adults, around the time that they might be going to university or leaving home, may be more mobile, they may move more often and just be less likely to provide that information to any of the government agencies. We have had a couple of different approaches for how we combine this information. As of the 2018 census, it was a reasonably simplistic approach, which in the majority of cases just took the most recent address update, regardless of which source that was provided in. And for the most part, that still makes a reasonable amount of sense. But for 2023, we have further investigated slightly more complex approaches. For example, there's this machine learning model that uses the similar types of information, but can be a bit more informative about predicting what that actual best current address is likely to be. As with this and other things, we have published information. We have a lot more detail if that's of interest, but I won't go into it here. And just to show what that looks like, this is an indication of the quality of the admin addresses we have. And so the dashed line at the top represents our sort of hypothetical best possible consistency. And that's how many people in our admin population have the correct address in any of the admin sources. And it's about 95%, although a little bit lower again for young adults. The middle line is a representation of the machine learning approach, and then that line at the bottom is similar to the prioritized approach used in 2018. So some improvement from that more complex method, but they're all reasonably okay for most populations, just struggle with that young adult group. I will also say here that this looks at the quality of addresses for an individual, how often that address is correct. When we looked at aggregated counts of populations, a lot of these differences do disappear or get smaller. There tend to sort of be balancing effects where you might get two people wrong, but they might cancel each other out. So for population counts, it doesn't necessarily end up as bad as it maybe looks here. In terms of the admin households, we have a reasonably simplistic approach to this in terms of we just combine that admin population and the admin addresses and use that directly to build this idea of a household. So all of the people that are assigned to a given address are combined to create that household concept. We also have information about the relationships between people in a household. So we might have marriages, birth records, other types of information that identify partners, parents and children, and from there we can extend that to other types of relationship too. And this tends to be reasonably good, but there are some gaps, particularly with less formal relationships. Overall, though, what we see is that households are more complicated than individual addresses. There is more chance of missing a single person, incorrectly including a single person, which makes that household slightly different or incorrect. And I think it's also just more complicated, that combination of people. There are more ways that you can measure that they are less likely to be stable in a variety of ways. So, for example, it might be that we see that 85% of addresses are consistent, but that corresponds to 60% of households, or something like that. And I will also just note here that one of the other challenges we have is, or one of the questions we had, was around what considers, or how we consider an admin household to be good enough or close enough to the truth or to census. Do we want to be quite strict and say all of the people have to be the same, or are we sometimes okay accepting some differences if the type of household is the same? So there's some challenges or complexity there too. So that essentially was the admin methodology. And again, a lot of that existed prior to the 2018 census. And the question became, how do we combine that? So here we have a representation of those two data sets that we essentially ended up with in 2018. On the left, we have census responses, green representing where we've got some information about a person. And you can kind of imagine that the sort of rows going down represent a person, and then columns or going across represents information attributes like age or income or ethnicity. And the census, for most people, we get a lot of information, but as Abby has already talked about, not information for everyone. On the right, we have this admin resident population. And here we have a higher coverage list, more people included, but not quite as much information. Some variables aren't measured at all in admin data. So what we did is we looked at these two side by side. We linked those census responses to the admin list. And I think the link rate here was about 98%. And the key group, I think, of interest here is in the bottom left there. And these are the people who we think should have been included, but were missed or not counted in census. And so these are the ones that we wanted to consider adding from admin data. And the main challenge that we had is that we don't necessarily want to include all of those admin people. And that's partially because they just might not be correct. They might have been included incorrectly. They might be in the completely wrong place. But also that if we threw everybody in, we might end up with too many people included overall, which is challenging for a variety of reasons. So we ended up with this process that we called admin enumeration, which involves determining which of those people should be included. And I'm not going to go into this in a huge amount of detail. Again, more information available if it's of interest. But we had this key question that I talked about, and that Abby has mentioned with those principles up front. Again, summarized essentially as we want to include people when they are probably correct, they probably are in the right place, are in the population. And we also wanted to do that without leading to bias or over coverage of population counts overall, or within specific subpopulations. So we ended up with this two-step approach where we put people into dwellings when we had good evidence that they would improve the quality of the household, they would improve the quality of the family outputs that we produce. But then we had a second step where we put people into the file, but not a specific dwelling, when we were sure they should be counted in general, but where we had less confidence around that household family aspect. And we had a range of different approaches to this, depending on the type of response we might have received. So for example, if we had a dwelling that we thought had a partial response, we would use a different approach to if we didn't get any response at all from a dwelling. But I won't touch on that here. So this is again just kind of what it looks like in the end, all squished together, unsurprisingly, more people included, more information. Note this is not quite to scale. The final proportion of records coming from admin data was about 11%. So that was, yeah, kind of what we did. Obviously, a lot more detail beneath that. But I would just talk briefly about some of the process for making these decisions, or for our assessment of these results against the sort of criteria laid out earlier. And this is just one example for the quality of admin households. So this is specifically where we have a dwelling that exists and we didn't get any response at all, but where we had evidence from admin data that people did live there. So here there was a statistical model which essentially predicted how likely it was that the admin household was correct. And on the right, we see this in essentially two dimensions that we considered. And the best households are the ones in that top right-hand corner, where we are confident about most things. The final threshold was to include records within that yellow shaded area, which represented that we was about 50% chance or better that the household was correct, the correct type of household, and that most people were genuinely usual residents. But we considered a range of different thresholds as part of this work, looked at the impact that would have on final census counts, weighed up the different types of error. And again, as kind of talked about earlier, different decisions could have been made here, but this was what we came to through the assessment process. Here again, just showing something slightly different, that this is looking at the type of people included in different cases. And again, the point here being that the bluish line across the middle represents the age distribution of census responses. The other lines represent the age distribution of admin records that got included. And a really clear representation that they're not the same, that the types of people being added or the types of people responding, not the same, that we are really getting clear value including these admin records. I think I'll just skim through a couple more, but this is again just showing the kind of comparisons that we did. So the yellow line here represents a separate estimate we had of the true population, and the blue bars are the final census counts that we had. They line up pretty well, but some differences. And again, along the way, we looked at this with different sort of decisions made, different criteria to see these differences and how this looked. This essentially the same comparison, but showed as a relative difference. And here we've also added in the 2013 census results for comparison in yellow. And the point being that we ultimately ended up somewhere similar, but actually probably better in some cases. And then just one final set of results. Apologies for the changes in colors, but this is showing the same thing for geographic areas. And this is where it probably is actually more obvious the advantage of using admin data, where the orange here, the smaller lines, tend to represent where we ended up in 2018. And we do think sort of more consistent coverage than we might have had in the past. So I will just very briefly touch on a couple of, I guess, the key lessons. Some of this will overlap with what Vince said right up front. Having access to that data in the first place and having that existing research was really helpful for us. Obviously, without the data, we wouldn't have been able to do this. But even with the research that we had already, it was a different process, or we did learn a lot from actually doing it in practice. There were parts of combining the data sources that are challenging, and that's where some of these decisions, these thresholds come into play, that they aren't always, or at least in our situation, weren't always straightforward. And yeah, just throwing them together wouldn't necessarily have worked. We also found that in some cases, understanding or analyzing those results can be challenging. For example, when we were looking at differences between 2013 and 2018 census, this difficulty in identifying when those changes were real world change, when something had actually changed, versus what was due to our change in methodology and approach. But ultimately, this use of admin records clearly gave us improved data quality than we would have achieved without that, particularly in reducing this bias or these differences across subpopulations. At the same time, no data source is perfect. Certainly we saw that collection wasn't perfect, but also admin data has its limitations. That said, in combination, they can do a really good job of improving data quality overall. And then just very last slide, same points again as earlier. Having that transparency, openness along the way did help. Having people involved in that journey did give them more confidence, I think, in the end. And having the independent assurance also helps in a similar way. In terms of where we went after 2018, we did use this for 2023 with the idea being for it to be by design, planned in advance. And a lot of, I think, what we saw was that where we ended up in 2018 was pretty good. And yes, there were things to tweak, but actually the overall idea framework was pretty successful and worked well. And this international collaboration, this ongoing support, really useful. So yeah, great to be here if this can provide some value and use to you as well. And I'll stop there. And I can stop sharing too.
Okay, thank you very much, Vince, Nathaniel, and AB for this fantastic and inspiring presentation. It was so clear and very interesting and useful. All of the information that you shared with us. We have a few questions. I written down on the chat. The first question is, in cases of omission of persons in households that responded to the census, did you add those persons from administrative records? How did you do that using the address information?
Yeah, I can try to answer that one. So the idea is that we tried to do that, yes. So if we had some evidence that a household had responded, but that they might have missed people, we also looked at the administrative records there, and we only considered people if their admin address corresponded to the same household. And our approach was to sort of combine that admin address information with relationships. So if we had confidence that that admin person, we could identify a relationship to someone in the census household, that was pretty good evidence that they were genuinely missed. We were a little bit more conservative in that approach than where we didn't get a response at all. And it will have missed cases like flatmates or unrelated people, but it was trying to balance that, relationship address.
Excellent, thank you. Second question is, if a private dwelling was surveyed and occupied during census operation, but later individuals were added to it through administrative records, do you change the occupancy status of that dwelling to occupied in the final data set?
So this is actually a really good and interesting question too, I think, so in our census at least, the occupancy status is a census night concept and primarily still based off the field collection identification of that occupancy. So if the field had considered it to be occupied in the first place, we had admin records, they went in and we left it as occupied. If field had said that the dwelling was unoccupied on census night. We didn't change it to occupied, but we changed it to our essentially usually occupied status. So depending on which, so it's like complicated, and maybe the answer there was a kind of, depending on the definition. We didn't want there to be cases where we had admin people while we were also saying that the dwelling was completely empty or unoccupied. So some consistency within our messy classification.
Okay. Thank you. If someone from our team wants to jump in to something else, I'm just reading their questions, but maybe they need more clarification. But okay. So next question. Did you introduce any type of adjustments in the data set to address for biases in census answers as a result of higher omission of the hard to count populations?
Not specific adjustments. So I think for the most part, we just kind of assumed that these would come through from the admin data, in the sense that that admin approach means that the people you're counting from admin data will be somewhat different and will have those, will account for some of the biases, in the sense that, you know, for example, if we miss young people, or if we miss overseas born people more from census responses, the admin data will capture that reasonably well. And so the admin data will recover and help with that bias. And we certainly saw that that was more true than some of the statistical imputation we had originally gone for. Within like the variables themselves, so for income or for you know, ethnicity, the imputation process beyond admin data again tries to account for that, but we didn't make any explicit or different adjustments, I don't think.
Thank you. Next question is, admin households members that are associated with non-response dwelling and do not link to individual census answers are defined as eligible households to be included in the census data set. What happens in cases where some persons in the census eligible household link to the census and others do not?
Yeah, so we essentially just treated it in such a way that people who linked to a census respondent were excluded from the subsequent processes. Because yeah, this is quite a kind of complicated situation where you have essentially contradictory information or partial information. Just checking I'm answering the right question. Yeah, so, and these are the cases where they were still eligible, as in like the non-census responding part was still eligible to go into that household without the census people. But in reality, I suspect these are the cases where we often end up with less confidence that the admin household is correct, and so they are potentially the people that end up sitting in the file, but outside of the household and family data set, because that was a reasonably significant chunk of the population that, fall into this or different complex scenarios.
I might just add as well, those situations were ones where we required much stronger evidence if we were to alter what a respondent had said. So if a respondent had said that they lived with their partner, but their partner hadn't responded, and we had an admin person that we had evidence was their partner, we would add them in. But if we had an admin person that contradicted that partner relationship, then we wouldn't put them into that dwelling because it disagreed with respondent information. And as Nathaniel said, if they couldn't go into a dwelling, then they would go into the area.
Okay, thank you. You explained during the presentation how you created households from administrative records. Can you give us some details on the what kind of sources you say marriage and also birth, maybe birth certificate or what else? Thank you.
Yeah, so we have some information about those, legal relationships, sort of births, marriages. We used some information from previous censuses. So if we had information about, again, parent-child relationship from 2013 census, that still holds. Partner relationships are a little bit more complicated because obviously they can change, but we still use that where possible. There's a little bit of information from some benefits through the tax system, again, particularly when you've got families or parents that are getting different benefit payments. The one other source that we might not have had in 2018, but we've had more recently, is to do with visa applications and border movements data. So particularly when people are moving to New Zealand to live, our Customs Border Movement Agency records some relationships between people, and that's actually really useful because those are the types of people that otherwise might not be measured very well in our admin data sources, and it seems quite useful again in our somewhat fortunate situation. So there's a few that we combine and end up pretty good.
Thank you. You also explained that you use, you import or take data from administrative record to in census variable where you have had a missing at the variable level. I mean, and for instance, in education or other topics. And did you mark those cases and those variables with some kind of source code at the final data set?
Yes, we did. And yeah, we thought that was really important to do. So in our final unit record data set, all of the, so both the people themselves have a data source about whether that record was added from a census response or admin data, but also all of the different variables. So yeah, for birthplace, it will say there'll be that different variable, that source that says census response or 2018 or 2013 census or imputation. So yeah, really important, I think.
Okay, thank you. What about the how did you adjust for, I mean, where coverage over count when incorporating individuals and households from administrative registers? Or I mean, to avoid duplicates or yeah.
So, and Abby, you jump in here if it was covered, but no, that's fine. So yeah, and so duplicates are a bit of a challenge, specifically and particularly with that probabilistic linking. So we have some processes to try to get at that at the as early as possible in terms of checking the quality of the linking and the like. But we ended up making one sort of aggregate adjustment to roughly how many unidentified missed links, duplicates we might have had. And that was kind of just saying, based on our best estimate, we think that roughly this many people or this type of person will have ended up as overcoverage duplicates. We're going to limit the admin population by about that much. We then will have estimated the overall coverage through the post-enumeration survey. And that goes into the population estimates, but not the census counts themselves. So it's kind of, yeah.
Okay, thank you. So were all estimated people omitted from the census added from records, or you had some few cases that you decided or you couldn't add from registers?
Yeah. So was that about the admin people?
Yeah, I mean, you estimated around, I don't know, 10% of omitted persons, and you added all of them from administrative register, or you just had a few cases that you couldn't add from administrative registers?
Yeah, so there were a few people or some records that we ended up not including for a variety of different reasons. But yeah, particularly when we just weren't as confident that they were high quality. So yeah, and that's definitely I think the challenge is kind of towards there's a lot of really good admin records, but certainly some towards the edges are more complicated, and we ended up not including.
Okay.
My memory,
okay. Yes, sure.
Nathaniel, was that we had a good hard look at that group that we ended up not including, and they were still younger than average. But we got quite a bit of reassurance when we looked at that group and saw that the proportion of that group that were from Indigenous population that had been subject to quite significant differential non-response, the proportion of people from our Indigenous population sort of almost back to normal proportions in that final group that we didn't include. So we took some encouragement from that the reasons that group, the final group, were not being included was probably more to do with their youth and their mobility and the poor quality of their address information than anything related to their ethnicity or their general low economic status.
Okay.
Yeah, I would just add as well, because of the way our system works, our census counts become an input into our population estimates, and in between those we do a coverage adjustment. We were really cautious not to introduce over coverage into the census file, mostly because our coverage methodology is all designed around our historic pattern of having undercount rather than overcount. So in order to minimize the dominoes onto that part, as well as support understanding from our data users who are used to us missing people, they're not so used to us putting a whole bunch of people in the wrong place. So we were cautious, but like Vince said, the majority of that group were young people, highly mobile populations, and also I think recent entries into the country. So there was a higher proportion of Asian ethnicity who had just moved to New Zealand. And typically those populations come in via Auckland, which is our biggest city, and then distribute. So us putting them all into Auckland would have been incorrect, but we didn't know where else to put them. So we relied on our coverage methodology to work that part out.
Thank you. And the last question is related to question 2. Did you make any changes about the dwellings occupancy status for dwellings located in mesh blocks where you added some people not associated to a dwelling?
So no, we didn't. With those people that not associated to a dwelling, they don't have any interaction with dwellings or with dwelling occupancy status, even if their admin address kind of corresponded to it. We kind of kept those separate.
Okay. Well,
Good
thank
question.
you very much. It was fantastic, very useful, valuable for us, and also inspiring. And yes, and yeah, we'll be in contact, you know. Yes, of course. Yeah. And, well, I want to thank you, all of you. Thank you very much, and see you soon.
See you. So look, it's a great pleasure to be working with you. We're looking forward to future engagement.
Yes. Gracias a todos los participantes y bueno, nos vemos en el próximo webinar la semana próxima con la experiencia de Noruega. Goodbye. See you.
Gracias.
Bye. Thank you for coming.
Well done, you guys.
Well done, team.